Welcome to Good Revenue. We're joined today by Matt Moscardi. He's the founder of FreeFloat Analytics. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So we'll jump right in. Could you tell us a little bit about FreeFloat and how you measure and think about board performance?
The simple way to say it is we measure the people who run companies and we measure it for investors. We know a lot about how companies perform for cash flows and accounting, but we have very few, if any, metrics on the people, which is ironic given how much markets are built on measurement and companies are really just piles of people to begin with. So we fill a market niche by measuring management, giving them a report card. It takes a tremendous amount of data to do it. And we do it in two ways. We measure their influence and their performance built off that influence.
What are the key markers you track across the board, or are they grouped into influence and power?
We group them into influence and power effectively, but even inside that, we group them. We want to know how important any one individual is in any given time on the board or on the management team. We are covering 200,000 directors and 40,000 named executive officers at 10,000 companies. We have a 5-year history. It's a lot of people. And we have 30 data points on every single one of them, covering their resume, their status, whether they're a shareholder or an insider, their role on the management team, and their social networks. I don't mean LinkedIn, work affiliations with each other, whether or not they know each other, they've had similar backgrounds. But we end in this place where we can tell someone, Jane has 20% influence on board X in year Y. And then to get to performance, we basically assign Jane 20% of the outcomes of the company in that year. So for us, it's a linear process. We say, how powerful are you? How loud is your voice? Are you the alpha in the room? What's your influence? And then we can multiply that influence times the outcome. And over time, we can show how any individual management member has performed.
How do you measure power on boards?
We use something called win shares. And the method here is best described in an example. We want to know how often one person, a director or manager, beats the other people in a position of power. Take directors. We'll say something like, how many of the directors in the room are or were in their past a CEO? If you're the only CEO in a room full of directors, that has power. You effectively beat the other directors in the room for that. But we want to know how much power that has, because if you're at a large cap company, that may be really rare. We want to set an expectation because we know, like at a small cap company, only 10% of directors roughly were CEOs before, a small cap US company. When the number is that small, if you're the only director, it's actually what we'd expect one director roughly to have been a CEO before. But if you're a large cap company, we expect 5 and you're the only one, then there's more value to it. We can do that across 30 different data points where we can contextualize who you are, where you came from, who you know, and what you do on any number of metrics, and assign wins to you. How valuable is that in that room? How many wins, quote unquote, is that worth? Which is an idea from baseball and basketball analytics.
What about influence consolidation? Can you tell us a little more about what that concept means?
Once you have wins, you can add them up and say the influence number, the percentage I show you, is the percentage of wins you have relative to everybody in the room in that year. Now, influence consolidation would be understanding when a minority of people or one person in the room has the majority of influence. So the best way to think about it is like a government, right? Is this company a democratic company where everybody's voice is equal? So 10 board members, 10% influence each, which never happens, but that would be no influence consolidation. More often than not, you see a CEO chair or a founder with, dual class shares or some mechanism that says, oh, Mark Zuckerberg has not just a lot of influence. He has the majority. In fact, what he says matters most. And I think the number for Zuckerberg is we estimate 72% of the influence. But in reality, anything over 50% is effectively 100%. It means that person has consolidated all the power with themselves, sometimes not with just one person, but it could be a CEO chair combination, like at Activision Blizzard, where you have Bobby Kotick, Bob Morgado, and Brian Kelly. That's 3 people who own 80% of the influence of that board. That is influence consolidation amongst three bros. So the reason why we care about that is we want to know who's actually responsible for making the decisions, how few people is that, and do they reflect the decisions you might want to make or see made as an investor?
So does influence consolidation connect back to the results or the performance of a company? Do you track that?
Yes, we try to track that. But if you're talking about revenue growth or TSR or earnings, those are indirect things that a board might actually vote on. They don't vote on that, right? Those are outcomes of the company, and we can track indirect performance in that way. But when it comes to consolidation of power, the things we know that a board votes on, like dividends, CEO pay, or share buybacks, those are direct votes that directors have to. We do see certain power cohorts tend to vote in the same way everywhere they go. So we know that if you have a director who has outsized influence and they happen to be on the nominating committee and you see the CEO gets paid a lot every single year, when they go someplace else and they have a lot of power, we can see the same pattern emerge. So we track performance in as much as we can say that this person has a tendency to vote or act in a way. And when they have power, that outcome is more likely. So from that perspective, absolutely. We were watching directors or management teams for that kinds of performance.
And I noticed that you also track seniority as well as power on boards. Can you tell us a little about how you think about this and how those metrics tie back to the performance of a company?
Seniority is a mechanism to gaining power, right? Most boards value seniority in as much as they give more senior members of a board the chair roles of committees, or they give them more power in terms of the role that they're assigned. Some board members, we see board members in the data that have been on boards for 20, 30, 40 years. Some aren't even founders. They've just been around. They might have worked at the company, retired, and joined the board a couple of years later. There's a lot of that in Asia where you see like long minority, but they exist. Mechanism sort of own influence as you can raise your hand in a meeting and say, I've been here a long time and this is the way we do things, and you're new on that board. There's a social tension, right? Like your ability to basically say, that's not the way it should be done is limited by the fact that 1, 2, or 3 people on that board may have much longer tenures and have entrenched views of how to run this board or these committees or in this way. So in that way, seniority can be intertwined with power. In terms of performance, we often see seniority can be negatively correlated to something like privacy and data, emerging issues. So you see companies where there's new emerging issues like climate change. If you've been on a board for 40 years, no one talked about climate change 40 years ago, but now it's a big deal. We see boards with longer tenured members with entrenched views that can underperform on something like carbon because they don't know how to manage it. They have to bring in outside consultants, and there's this is the way it's done attitude that can obstruct progress on some performance metrics.
What I hear you saying in that too is, I think, tied back to maybe diversity of perspective and experience, and maybe also of tenure. How do you think about that when it comes to board performance? How do you think about those factors?
We talk about groupthink all the time, right? So we draw a distinction between diversity and inclusion. And diversity you can measure by body count. I could say 30% of the board is female or 25% is people of color. But we want to measure groupthink. We want to measure diversity of perspective, which we can measure using these social connections that I mentioned, right? So we have 220,000 board members and data on boards going back 20, 25 years. When we have time bounds and we can say this person was on this board from X to Y, or they worked at this company from X to Y, we created a social map with 2.5 million connections between these 200,000 directors over time using algorithms that LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook. If Jane on the board knows John, then Jane might also know Jim through mutual connections. We can use algorithms to form those communities. When you see those communities, you can map behavior. And this gets us to a place where we can say, this community, we know of communities that are twice as likely to restate their financials. We know of communities that are significantly more likely to pay dividends. And when you can map behaviors of these communities, you can start to say, what kind of groupthink am I getting? Is the board that I bought a stock in this company that I'm supposed to elect these directors, do they represent me or do they represent each other? Because they're from a very close-knit community. We've even gone so far as to map education backgrounds and say, what percentage of your board went to Stanford? What percentage went to Stanford and they're all roughly the same age? And they've been on the board the same amount of time. These are all elements that you can say, it doesn't matter if your board is a panoply of color and gender. If they all went to Stanford, measure that as well. So we absolutely measure that. We see it affects board performance because a lot of behavior is viral. There's academic research that shows board members will carry their experience from one board or one management position into their next one. And if there was no negative consequence for a behavior, then they are more likely to carry that behavior with them forward, even if later on we can view it as negative. So we know there's a link to performance, and you can measure some of this perspective diversity with the metrics that we have.
So what does representation look like in public markets today? What are some of your insights around that?
Classic metrics show that 25 to 30% of boards, depending on where you are, female. In the US, we know that something like 15% of boards are people of color. Where we have that data. Instead, what is the influence those people have? If you have 30% of the board that's female, but those women only own 20% of the power, that's a gap. You've stacked the board with one cohort to show diversity, but those people don't actually have the power to make change. They have less power in the room. We measure those power gaps. When we talk about diversity, we talk about the gap between their representation in the room and their inclusion in the power structure. And we can show that for every company, particularly in the US, where we have really good data, race and ethnicity, and everywhere else, we have really good data on gender. So we can show diversity, how it matters, and whether or not it really exists, company by company across 10,000 companies.
Does that mean that gender diversity or racial diversity is a double-edged sword, or what are some of your findings from the analysis?
There's academic research that shows it. The tendency is the more power women have, it can cut against those same women when it comes to decision making. In fact, there's research that shows that in good times, women tend to be listened to more in the boardroom. And when things go wrong, there's a reversion to inherent biases. And that means like status quoism of male dominated boardrooms. The more aggressive voices, the louder voices take over. So there's evidence to suggest, because there's a lot of conversation about like having at least 3 women on your board, or at least 30% women, or some number where once you get over that, you're into territory where you see better performance, you see all these positive outcomes. What we see is when women have more power, they often get held to a different standard than men do. We see votes against women in power more often from investors. And that's not just the anti-woke. But we also see that having many women in the room is great when times are good, for instance, but not as great when times are bad, when they are purposefully marginalized. So there's all sorts of nuance to the question of diversity and power and the double-edged nature of it. What is right actually can be specific to a company, but we know if you have diversity without inclusion, then you haven't achieved the goal of risk-adjusted decision-making. Academic research shows better risk-adjusted decisions by diverse teams with diverse perspectives.
What does inclusion look like in your data? And do you have a sense of what the drivers are for the lack of inclusion, if those two things go hand in hand, diversity and inclusion?
What inclusion looks like in the data tends to be a minority of companies where the power, the influence that a diverse cohort has is equal or greater than their representation in the room. Even if you had 10% women, but the women had 40% of the power, that to us is much closer to inclusion than saying that there's only 10% women in the room. So we have a notion of what it looks like. One of the biggest barriers to getting there, we recognize, is we know that the glass ceiling exists. And we actually did a paper where we showed once you've broken through the glass ceiling, there's actually a recycling rate of women. Companies, management teams, and nomination committees and boards are more likely to pick women who have already been on a board and they're a known quantity to join their board later on, to the exclusion of new or diverse perspectives. As in, we see people of color, minorities, women who tend to be more connected to the boards they sit on and sit on more boards because those boards are comfortable with the decisions they're going to make. They're known entities, they're known quantities. And in a way, it's easy to sort of marginalize or control that voice or vote. It's part of the social power status quo, and it's measurable. We know that women have a recycling rate that's roughly 10% higher than men. And that's men who are in bro networks getting handed off to companies all over the place. And women, but they are recycled at a higher rate, means that you're just not getting as much diversity into the boardroom. You're getting more of the same. And we know that comes with an inclusion barrier.
So does that mean when we say we want more representation on boards, instead of arguing for 50-50 on boards, we should really be looking for more distribution of power? Because one of the things you said earlier that struck me is it seems like the power law, right? The dynamics of clusters of power. So should the goal be having more equitable power distribution among board members?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I think you want the diversity that's already in the room. First of all, you need to get diversity in the room. Diversity is an important step. You have to get in the room. You have to crack that barrier. But once you're in the room, the ask should be, is my power equal to my existence in this room? Do I have a voice in this room? And I think that's something that investors can and should be pushing for when new directors are added, that they're immediately assigned roles to make sure that those directors that are added are not already connected to existing directors, that they come from outside. They might be true outsiders, and that they're not the only outsider. They can't be the only one. Otherwise, they're not going to have the power in that room. They need to be coupled with other people of diverse perspectives who are outsiders. The real goal here is diversity of perspective, diversity of the types of humans you choose, and you want those perspectives to be heard. That's what you want. So that's what I think the ask should be. It shouldn't be 50-50 body count. It should be equitable representation of ideas.
Do you also find that more representation, distribution of power, equitable representation of ideas, does that actually improve the performance of companies? Are there financial reasons that we should be supportive of this?
Yes, there's evidence that shows better risk-adjusted decision-making. If you think of the board as playing defense and management is playing offense, management wants to be aggressive. The board's job is to keep them from getting in trouble. That's exactly the outcome you want. The reason why we don't see great performance metrics about actual power of diverse cohorts and boards and their effect, the reason why that data doesn't exist is because it's a null data set. You avoided something. How do you measure what you avoided? You can't really measure that. But the academic research shows that in social situations, we know that to be the outcome. The way that decisions get made, they tend to be more deliberative. They tend to be better at assessing risk, better at assessing unknown risk, particularly when you have something like tenure and age too. A great case study is when Southwest last holiday season couldn't fly because they couldn't take any reservations. Their reservation system went down. It was the culmination of 10 years of underinvesting in technology on a board that was the worst of the worst for long tenured old white directors. They had no diversity of perspective. I'm not saying young people know technology better, but we know from the metrics that the likelihood that room was going to make a decision that was progressive to invest in the company for a 10-year outcome is much lower because they're all of retirement age. There's no incentive for them. They're all friends. Dissent is not part of the equation. If you're looking for higher TSR and higher revenue growth with higher inclusion, you're looking at the question wrong in my mind. Because what you want is to avoid negative growth and negative TSR. You want to avoid blow-ups. You want to invest in the future. And you need those diverse perspectives because all of the social science suggests that those are how decisions get made when you have true diversity and true inclusion. Those are the things that you'll avoid, the blow-ups.
I think this is fascinating. I have two final questions for you. The first is, given all of this data and your experience, what do you think high performance companies do differently from the pack?
Two things. Number one, they are unafraid of an outside perspective, of criticism, of an open dialogue, right? I just read Allison Taylor, who was on our podcast, Business Pants. She wrote a book called Higher Ground that comes out in February about ethical behavior at corporations. She points out that for a company to be ethical or good at anything, it takes a coordinated effort engaging every stakeholder in a systematic, thoughtful way. It has to be true and authentic. You have to want it and be willing to hear all of that sort of negative. So being unafraid is important. I also think being metric driven and open to understanding the metrics is important too. We still are in a sort of culture of my gut says, let's do this, when often there's a data set that can show you there's a different way to do that. I'm not saying data solves all problems, but data is important. I think you want to engage the data and look at something that says, we talk about diversity. Are we really diverse? We talk about our emphasis on this positive cultural attribute, but our management team all came from this other cultural aesthetic or place. To the extent that you can measure those things with data, I think it's important to get it.
So last question then, what is your top advice for CEOs and boards right now?
First of all, you have unenviable jobs. There are 8,000 people asking something of you all the time. And my top advice is don't be afraid to listen to them. A high-performing team is as good as its weakest link. Don't be afraid to listen, take in criticism, be humble about it, understand it, and surround yourself with people who won't tell you what you want to hear. They'll tell you what you need to hear, and be willing to make different decisions to alter course. That doesn't mean bowing to the loudest voice in the room, but if like our data, for instance, says that you have a consolidation of power, you are a CEO, chair, founder, and the likelihood that you're going to hear dissent is low, there's a reason for that because it probably is that way. You can have agency in changing some of those outcomes, removing some of the power from yourself, being more democratic, being more open. Those are not easy things, but those are very true things. The long-term outcomes of all that, all of the data and academic research tends to suggest the highest performing teams, the highest performing individuals, all are best at that. They all have the longest value, the longest brand value. They generate the most in terms of performance almost across the board.
I think that's very sage advice. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciated it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us here at Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review, follow the show, or share it with a friend. We're a news show, so it really helps other listeners find us. And if you have feedback, comments, or suggestions for episodes or guests, please reach out to us. You can find our information in the show notes. This show was produced with the help of RPS Audio, experts in sound and podcast production.